Poor infrastructure is an impediment even to Africa's fastest growing economies. Investment in infrastructure needs to double. So how will new models of financing bridge that infrastructure gap? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to this special edition of Talk Africa from the World Economic Forum on Africa in Cape Town. Welcome to the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, and welcome to this special session on meeting the infrastructure challenge, that is meeting Africa's infrastructure challenge. Now, Africa started out with stocks same as that of Southeast Asia in the 1960s. By 2000, though, Africa had been left far behind. At a population of 1.03 billion people, Africa's infrastructural needs can no longer meet the demand. So today, my panelists on this session will be discussing the key question on whether models of finance can close Africa's growing infrastructural gap. This session is also linked to the Global Challenge Partnership on Long-Term Investing, Infrastructure and Development. Welcome to this session. May I now introduce my distinguished panelists for this section. His Excellency Jacob Zuma, President of the Republic of South Africa. Welcome. Mr. V. Shankar, the Group Chief Executive Officer, Europe, Middle East, Africa and Americas of the Standard Chartered Bank from the United Arab Emirates. Welcome. Ms. Kay Kohonda, she's the Executive Vice President and the Chief Executive Officer of the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, from Washington. Welcome to the program. And the Right Honorable Gordon Brown, the Chair, World Economic Forum, Global Strategic Infrastructure Initiative, and he's a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 2007-2010. Welcome. Mr. Patrick Dlamini, he's the Chief Executive and Managing Director, Development Bank of Southern Africa. Welcome. President Zuma, perhaps I'll start off with your exact needs here for South Africa. Now, South Africa's lack of capacity, particularly in the power sector, is known the world over. Now, over 200 water and sanitation programs have been mentioned in this year's budget. Road upgrades are needed. Rail and bus services need funding. $1 billion to expand broadband services for government institutions and schools. Over $21 billion have been allocated for this work. What exactly is the infrastructural need for South Africa? Does this really meet your needs, the $21 billion, and how is it all going to be funded?
Well, definitely South Africa needed to deal with the issue of infrastructure that firstly arises out of South Africa's history, because its economic structure was structured in a wrong way before 1994, and therefore we needed to catch up, so to speak, to expand the infrastructure so that we can grow the economy. Because even if we wanted to grow the economy, without proper infrastructure, we could not have been able to do so. And that's why we're focused on the infrastructure. We believe is very critical for us to do so. What we did in order to make it move, we did not leave it in different departments scattered. We established the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Commission, which has helped a great deal to pull everything together, and therefore to make the plan more broader, more consolidated. And I think once we did that, we're then able to see what are the gaps in terms of the financing. I believe that the manner in which, as a continent, we have moved on the infrastructure, we have created more clarity in terms of the investors. There are very specific things we talk about, very specific projects, right, which are, in a sense, clear what are the needs, even if the finances are big, but people know exactly. We are dealing with the risks. What are the risks? So that people should know. What has become important is that the leaders in the continent have come behind this, and they're supporting it, and therefore governments are able to stand as a guarantor. And I would want to say investors should have no fear this time around, because government, political support is there. They see the need. This is needed very urgently. So the investors must know this is the time to invest in the continent of Africa.
And I'll put that question to Mr. Shankar there. Are Africa's projects investable? President Zuma has just talked about that.
I would agree with the President that clearly Africa has come a long way in improving its infrastructure, and I see a lot more attention given to the topic of improving the infrastructure because the need for infrastructure is very compelling. I would just say this. It is estimated that Africa needs roughly about $100 billion of investment every single year for the next 20, 30 years to improve its infrastructure. The current spend on it is roughly half. So there is a financing gap of about 50 billion. The real question is that 50 billion going to be available? You started the discussion by referring to the Southeast Asian example or the Chinese example. But remember, there's a big difference between Africa and China and Southeast Asia. The domestic savings rate in Asia, in many of these economies, is north of 30, 40%. Africa has a low savings rate of 15% of GDP. So it requires a huge amount of foreign investment, foreign capital to come in and finance this. Will it be available? I think so, but there are some challenges. The new Basel III regulations is going to make it quite punitive for banks to provide project finance. The new Solvency II regime, which is coming in, is going to make it difficult for insurance companies to put out money as easily and as cheaply as they did before. So I think the fundamental point I would make is financing is going to be more challenged, so we all need to work together. And second, we need to think differently to addressing the Africa infrastructure deficit.
All right, Ms. Keiko Honda, though, you're involved in promoting foreign direct investment primarily by ensuring against risk. That risk factor for Africa, though, political risk, commercial risk, is it as bad or as high as the perception?
Well, and definitely there is a perception of Africa's risk is probably higher than elsewhere. But I think the point is regional and local investors have a better understanding of the risk. But as Shankar just mentioned, unfortunately, Africa needs to attract investors from elsewhere. So therefore, to compensate for that, we need to think about how to slice the risk. Risk can be sliced into several different ways. Risk can be a type of risk, such as political risk, credit risk, and then maybe other commercial risk. Also, risk can be sliced into like a construction term risk, as well as operational period risk. Also, risk can be categorized in a different seniority of getting the return, senior debts, several different measuring risk, as well measuring debts as well as equity. I think we can definitely solvable to kind of address that perceived risk.
Mr. Gordon Brown, two issues here, though. At 1.03 billion people now, $93 billion required. The challenges are huge. The funding is huge. What should Africa be building now? And looking at the challenges that President Zuma has talked about, South Africa, though, and other African countries facing challenges not dissimilar to those of South Africa, what is the best way forward, though, for African countries to deal with this?
Well, President Zuma has started by setting up his infrastructure initiative, and that's the right thing. And I think he should be congratulated on recognizing that you've got to have the political will, you've got to coordinate the delivery of infrastructure, you've got to have a complete emphasis and focus on getting the best results. And in cross-border projects, you've got to bring other countries in, and he and others are doing this in Africa. So there is a big start that has been made in recent years to getting the infrastructure built. Now, around the world, there is a surplus of savings, relatively low interest rates. This is a time of opportunity. Africa has got great reserves, mineral reserves. It's got great uncultivated farmland. It's got a population of young people ready to work. And we've got to find a way of making sure that Africa's growth can be speeded up by delivering the infrastructure that's necessary. So I suspect that Africa could grow 2% more a year if it could deal with these infrastructure problems. And that means millions of more jobs, as well as a higher quality of life. And I, for one, would like to see everybody coming together, China, America, Europe, and Africa, to see the potential that exists in Africa and to make the most of it.
All right, Mr. Dlamini, though 600 Africans still do not have access to electricity, there's a lot to be funded here. What infrastructure sectors, though, which infrastructural sectors does the Southern African Development Bank fund, and which ones are proving difficult to fund, and why?
Thank you, Beatrice. As the DBSA, our core focus area primarily in the area of energy, from energy generation to transmission all the way to distribution networks. And the second sector is transportation sector, which covers all the modes of transport. The third one being water infrastructure in terms of the building of dams. The fourth one is ICT, the information and communication technology. So, but then the biggest challenge that we are faced with as a continent in terms of infrastructure and promoting intra-regional trade and regional integration is the lack and poor state of our infrastructure networks. We need to have very efficient and effective infrastructure networks on the continent, but what we need to do, as actually it has been done through the leadership of WEF, through Mr. Brown's chairman of the Africa Strategic Infrastructure Initiatives, wherein we're looking at how we can drive these 51 PIDA projects into bankability. Actually, if we were to look at where China is today, China 30 years ago was nowhere, and many people thought it would never be able to get where it is today. But through very resolute political leadership, we see China where it is. An investment in its capacity to do things, China has become a global phenomenon. And in the next 30 years, I can confidently say to you that you will see a completely different African continent. Yes, the growth that we've seen hasn't been absorptive enough and job creative enough. That's what we need, because we are very much consumer driven, but now we need to say, how can we pave and open the space for the continent to play its role in the global supply chain?
All right.
Infrastructure is very key in that.
Infrastructure is very key. Let's look at sources of funding now, because we're looking at alternative sources of funding here. President Zuma, Africa would hope to tap into the BRICS grouping here, particularly, the BRICS initiative of the bank, which is still in its early stages. Is there room, though, in that for African countries to have their infrastructure funded through the BRICS Bank?
Yes, definitely. BRICS Bank is one of the possibilities. In fact, when BRICS was hosted in South Africa, I think for the first time, the leaders of the continent, particularly those who are leading very important economic areas, were invited, including others, to discuss with BRICS countries, given the fact that the bank was coming, what will be the BRICS group's attitude towards helping Africa. There was a very warm exchange. Certainly, the BRICS Bank, as you must have heard, is a developmental bank. And it is going to have its region here in South Africa. And that is done precisely to participate in the massive Africa's infrastructure and other economic activities that are going to take place. So BRICS Bank is one of the sources that will be there. It adds to the sources that have been there all the time, the World Bank, the IMF, and the other banks like DFIs that will be there. So I am convinced that much as it looks difficult because of the size of the finances that are needed, but the opportunities are big. If the heads of states under the AU have come together, I think that is the best guarantor to any other investor that the political and governance are behind this. So it will never go wrong. It's not being pushed by anything except the need of the citizens of this continent and the need that this continent must grow economically.
Mr. Gordon Brown, though, China's Exim Bank at the moment has pledged $1 trillion of financing to African infrastructure over the next 12 years. Now, in many African countries, though, there has always been a criticism about the previous, bilateral sources of funding, complaining about too many strings attached to, certain funding to certain countries. Now, in your current position, though, what is your position on the cost, on the source, and on the conditions of infrastructure funding?
Well, I think the President mentioned a project, INGA, which is capable of providing 40% of the electricity of Africa, the biggest hydroelectric project in the world, based in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but basically able to provide electricity to South Africa, but right across the continent of Africa. Provide electricity at a far lower price than people are paying at the moment. So it is a commercially viable option for the future. And therefore the question is, can you persuade international investors to come in to help finance as big a project as that, or other projects in hydroelectricity or in other areas that are also commercially viable? And I think we can. I think China is prepared to invest. I think America is prepared to invest. I think Europe is also prepared to invest. So we have got to find a way of bringing people together who are potential investors, showing them the commercial value of some of these projects, demonstrating that we've dealt with the risks that people perceive. And you see, it used to be said that Africa did not have the political will to deliver its infrastructure. That is disproved. We've seen in the Central Corridor project and in what President Zuma is doing, the will of the leaders to deliver the infrastructure. Then it was said Africa couldn't coordinate, cross-border problems, people wouldn't come together, too many difficulties of cross-country issues. But again, we've seen the countries coming together both under the African Union and in the different regions, partly because of President Zuma's leadership. And then it was said, of course, you couldn't focus on delivery, and there was no interest in efficiency. But again, that's disproved, because the Central Corridor project, the whole emphasis is on delivery. So the problems that have existed in the past are being addressed. There are many further problems that have got to be dealt with, but the opportunities now exist not just to do the smaller projects, but to do some of these bigger projects. And of course, powering Africa with the electricity that would give every person in Africa the chance of access to it would be one of the biggest and most successful projects of the whole century.
All right, Mr. Shankato, the whole question of private-public partnerships, that has been touted as a model to look at, and what comes to mind is the Kenyan model of annuity funding, where banks are funding contractors who will then build the roads and the infrastructure for up to 8 years and then hand it back to the government for maintenance. In terms of that, though, do you believe it is a viable model, though? I mean, viable model to provide infrastructure and still get returns in that same way?
I think it's the only way, because the size of the problem is quite large and the scale of the opportunity is so huge that it requires all of us to come together. So, whether you want to call it public-private partnership, or you want to call it blended finance, whatever term you want to use, I think it needs, as the President rightly said, you need development banks, you need aids, grants, you need commercial banks, bond markets, development institutions, risk mitigation institutions like MIGA. So you need everybody in here to address this challenge.
All right, Ms. Keiko Honda, I see you're nodding your head there.
Yes, well, of course, there are huge needs here. That means huge potential opportunity. So what we are talking about is not or, it's actually and. Private and public, including MDBs, DFIs. Of course, also our next question is how we can do it. There are a lot of wonderful ideas floating around. Political risk mitigants like us, and also credit enhancement. Project preparation for 3D, first loss taking for 3D. I think what we probably can do right now is under the World Economic Forum, President Zuma's, Prime Minister Brown's leadership, we have identified very interesting project. I think this is actually probably a great opportunity to test what kind of facilities really work. I think market testing will be the key to test those facilities to identify, which one that's really useful, then share the knowledge, then I think massively leverage some of the well market tested facility going forward. Think about the INGA. I think it will be the key private sector to enter into power purchase agreement with the relevant governments. But private investors want to show government will keep their word through the series of administration. Therefore, they need a breach of contract. I think this breach of contract, it's not going to be happening across the continent. Then I think private investors are very comfortable to coming in. Then, MIGA itself probably not large enough to cover entire INGA breach of contract of power purchase agreement. But if we can invite several different MDBs or DFIs, I'm pretty sure we can actually able to cover the risk to give a significant comforts to the private investors.
All right, President Zuma, that question to you, of course, private sector looking for commitment from political leaders.
Absolutely.
From leadership, Africa's leadership.
Yes. I think we've stated this, that the commitment from African leaders has never been so clear, so united as it is now, as we are dealing with the current infrastructure and the need for Africa to have its own intertrade. You cannot do it without infrastructure. You cannot even attract investment. You cannot even attract foreign direct investment. So we are giving political confidence to investors. We are here. It's not just the question of us wanting development. It's the demand. Our people are demanding it. There are a lot of economic, there's unemployment. We wanted to industrialize Africa. SADC, for an example, as a region, met a few months ago to work on a strategy to industrialize this region, and industrialization is what we need. So the possibilities are huge, and the political commitment is there, is clear. And that's why I'm saying we have reached a point in our way that is no longer the issue. I think no investor can say, look, we're not sure. Is it risky or whatever? I think Africa says, here we are ready to move as far as we could. Here are the projects, and people are working on them. And many of the infrastructure, different sectors, are actually championed by heads of states in the continent.
All right, Mr. Gordon Brown, yes.
Yeah, I think President Zuma sums it up, that there is political will to move things forward. When I was first involved in this project with the World Economic Forum 3 years ago, I used to say every political leader in Africa has got to show their commitment to infrastructure, and that is being done. And now you have a situation where in the Central Corridor in Tanzania, because it involves 5 countries, the 5 leaders are meeting every 3 months to deal with the problems. So that is the level of political commitment that you're seeing. And I think we can show that in Africa, the perception of risk is far greater than the actual risk. And then we can show surgically how each risk could be addressed in individual projects. Now, once you do that, then small and big projects can get off the ground, and that's where we want to get to.
All right, yes, Mr. Shankar.
Beatrice, I would just add to what Prime Minister Brown said, which is, the questions we're asking about Africa and the risk of project financing here, infrastructure financing, is no different from the questions which were asked about financing projects in Asia 30, 40 years ago. It's exactly the same thing. We don't need to reinvent the wheel in Africa. These things have been done elsewhere in the world. There are very successful models and can be replicated, and replicated very quickly.
And then to reassure investors, if I may just add, the World Bank and the regional development banks have been developing a credit enhancement facility. There's a lot of private sector banks involved with the aid agencies in developing this to make it available in emerging markets to allay people's worries about risk. Then there's a first and second loss facility that is being proposed by some of the regional development banks as well. So investors are getting, as a result of the demand for infrastructure and the analysis of the problem, investors are getting greater protection now than they had previously. And that should make it possible for people who've not considered investing in infrastructure, particularly in Africa, that should make them reconsider the position. And gradually over time, I think we'll see the attractions of investment in Africa being made more apparent to people who have not invested in the past.
All right, Mr. Shankar, though, on that note, has the degree to which banks are investing in Africa reduced, investors investing in Africa reduced or risen?
I think it's risen exponentially. I mean, it's not just the international banks, but also the local and regional banks in each one of these countries are rising powers themselves. I mean, let's not talk about international banks. I think the big story of banking today around the world is the rise of local and regional banks.
Thank you. President Zuma, you have the final word on this. And the commitment.
And the commitments. Well, thank you very much. Now, firstly, the PPPs are working. I think it's one way of addressing our economic coordination and also the participation by different sectors. I know that the railway lines that we're talking about were done in a colonial approach where each country wanted to reach where the mines were and reach the harbor. I think the very broader understanding and agreement by the African countries is actually saying that is no longer the option. The option is how do we connect? If we connect it to a harbor, it is for common purpose, not for one country only. The infrastructure sees Africa as one entity that we can move. As I talked about the faster train, there is already a thinking that there is a train that is going to touch all capitals in a short space of time so that the movement is quicker. We are also, part of the reason we're discussing the borders is because we are saying we cannot do intra-trade when it is difficult to cross the border. You know, for an example, people will move where the possibilities are. And this is a current situation if we talk about South Africa. People come to South Africa for a variety of reasons. One, because they think there are opportunities. Two, if there are problems of conflict, they think it's better in South Africa. They've explained this to us, why they will jump other countries and come to South Africa. It's because they believe there is a constitution that protects individuals and rights, and this is what we need to talk about as the leaders in the continent. That whilst we have these broad ideas, very, very useful, but we must also look at what are the situations in our own internal kind of situations. These are matters we are discussing. Related to the issue of the illicit funds, we have actually established a small grouping to look into this, and I think it's led by former President Thabo Mbeki. He has provided a report already, which tallies with what the UN is saying in terms of how much funds are going out. This is what is going to be discussed by the AU. What then do we do? We are again going to need the contributions to those who handle finances, because what has become clear is that on both sides there's something going wrong. To those countries where the money is going and where the money when the money is taken from, and perhaps to some degree some collaboration. So we've got to address that issue so that we can utilize those funds. It is absolutely important also for the citizens and leaders. We need to perhaps have less or not at all leaders who are strong men who want to do what they want. We need to appreciate that we are one continent, and we should therefore listen to one another. We should have one approach, one vision for the continent. And we should reach a point where we say, if there are some of us who are interrupting that process, what then will be the recourse or even punitive actions to ensure that we don't suffer because of other people?
All right. We're going to end it there for the moment, but thank you all for joining us here on this session. President Jacob Zuma, Mr. Shankar, Keiko Honda, Mr. Gordon Brown, and Mr. Patrick Delamine. Thank you very much for your insights on this session today on financing Africa's infrastructure. We'll leave it there for the moment. That is it from us, from the World Economic Forum. On behalf of the World Economic Forum on Africa and CCTV, thank you and goodbye.